Hello, and welcome to the Q&A. I do these every single Saturday, and I answer your questions that I find interesting. This is my opportunity to be a geek, so if you don't find any of the stuff here particularly familiar, then feel free to ask in the comments for clarifications. These will just be answers that just pop into my head. There won't be any scripting behind this. So this week we've got a bunch of questions largely related to the Eastern Orthodox, but generally to theological questions. So we'll start with the first question from Adrian. What's your opinion on the Eastern Uniates? Also, any possible unification with other churches actually possible in a reasonably close time frame? Now, I'll say right now, I don't know much about the Orthodox churches in Egypt, those being the Coptic churches and the Armenian churches. I have no idea how things are going there because I dismissed them pretty early on in my study of religions before I chose between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, who in my opinion have the two strongest historical positions in terms of what church is the true church. I ultimately, of course, chose Roman Catholicism. As for the Eastern Uniates, they are in full communion with Rome. There have been occasions where they have been a little bit obstinate. For example, you may want to look into the past when it comes to the interactions between the Eastern Uniates and the Pope after Vatican I, but generally they're pretty decent. Sometimes they do weird things like they teach Palimism instead of, Thomism, but these sorts of things aren't all that significant. They're pretty good in my opinion, and I think that the Eastern Divine Liturgy is more beautiful than the Latin Rite Masses, like the Tridentine and the Novus Ordo, of course. As for any possible unification with the other churches, I can only really comment on the Eastern Orthodox. There are a lot of problems to unpack, and we will talk specifically about one of them a little later in this video. But aside from that one, there needs to be two things that occur. First of all, the more autistic Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics need to chill out. And secondly, there needs to be an understanding of the place of Rome. These are the two issues. The theological issues were resolved even if they reject the results of the council at the Second Council of Lyon and the Council of Ferrara-Florence. Now, Ferrara-Florence is controversial, but so far as I understand, the Eastern Church doesn't consider the Second Council of Lyon to be nearly as problematic, and that essentially established most of the theological issues, issues about proceeding from fathers and sons and stuff like that. So I'll start with the first one. We need to stop these autistic people ruining the relations, right? Especially, I can obviously look within the Catholic side and see these sorts of, perhaps the more radical SSPX lot. I've had bad dealings with them in the past, as well as maybe the overly liberal types who aren't too keen on treatment of various groups by the Eastern Orthodox, although I suspect the latter will be much less of a problem because they don't really give a shit about the church anyway. Those sorts of people need to chill the fuck out, because a lot of the time it's this attachment to Thomism and insistence on its prime place as almost like canon law. And I agree, I think that Thomas Aquinas is brilliant, and the Scholastic school is probably the preeminent school of Catholic theology. I'm not throwing out Aquinas here. However, it's not the only way to slice it. And that brings me to the next lot, and that is the Neo-Palamites. The Neo-Palamites are the autists essentially within the Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm dismissing people like the old calendarists because I don't know their place, but the Neo-Palamites are the ones that I see as being probably the biggest opposition towards unity between the two churches, which I think is ultimately something to be desired. You have people like Meyendorff, I think it's John Meyendorff, and there's Vladimir Lossky, who were academics in the 20th century, and then more recently you have the likes of people like Jay Dyer. And they take Palimism in a really weird direction. First of all, they're influenced very strongly by Aquinas, and they use his language when Palamas himself decidedly didn't use his language. But also, their hard treatment of the essence-energy distinction borders on ditheism and therefore not Christianity. And I level this accusation having studied Palamas for quite a while in order to understand what is actually going on, as well as, of course, watching J. Dyer and watching other people. These people are incredibly influential, and essentially they're bordering on not Christian. And let me explain why, because I've just leveled one hell of an opposition right there. So, you have this difference of opinion in the West and the East. In the West, we treat God as essence on its own, essentially, and then there's the actus purus, which comes out of that being the act that creates the world. And then after that, you've got all other actions, including the actions of the incarnate Christ, being actions, actualizations of potentials. And then in the East, you have the essence energy, where the energies of God do various things like create the world and such. I'm not especially clear on the actual technicalities of that. However, I can tell you now that the treatment of the energies is extremely important to this issue. Because what separates Palamas from perhaps Losky, or at least what I've seen of Losky, and definitely of J. Dyer, is that J. Dyer and Losky treat the energies as a hard, distinct object that exists before time, time being the actualization of the world. The time is just, every moment to moment is the continued actualization of potentials, right? That's how Thomas Aquinas defined it, and that's how Meyendorff understands it. I don't think Dyer truly understands Aquinas enough to have even reached that point. But the problem is that if you have two distinct objects, and I say distinct objects pre-existing before time because the three persons of the Trinity are in one essence, if you have a hard distinction between the essence, the ousia, and then you've got the energeia, separate, then you've got two beings uncreated before time, and therefore you've got ditheism. You have to be very, very careful, because I certainly think J. Dyer falls into this trap. And it seems as if, considering some of the weird writings of the emigre Eastern theologians, that they come under this sort of camp as well. Obviously unintentionally, but that's the logical result of what they're saying. There's no avoiding that. Thankfully, Palamas himself doesn't appear to believe this. He appears to believe in a soft distinction, and therefore actual Palamism and Thomism is perfectly compatible. Even down to things like for example, in the beginning of the Triads, St. Gregory Palamas writes a section called Philosophy Does Not Save. And this is often interpreted to say that we should always just throw Aristotle out of the window. And that was basically what occurred after Palamism. You know, all of the Byzantine Thomists got thrown out. The humanism that persisted in the West got completely thrown out. And this weird Eastern mysticism sort of developed out of it. I mean, there's already hesychasm, but it sort of developed out. What is often ignored of these triads, however, is that Palamas himself says that in certain circumstances, Aristotelian logic is usable. I think the metaphor that he uses specifically is as draining the venom out of a snake in order to produce some sort of antidote. I'm not sure if that's precisely what he says. I know he mentions snakes and venom, though. And that's essentially what Thomas Aquinas did. He rejected things like the saying that matter was eternal, which is probably what Palamas was terrified of, because a lot of the Aristotelians, like both in the Islamic and the Christian camps, I can't speak for people like Moses Maimonides, but I know for a fact that Christians and Muslims, philosophers, reached the conclusion that matter was eternal, as Aristotle did, whereas Aquinas obviously rejects this. And I think that's what Palamas was afraid of. He wasn't trying to create some new sort of philosophical way of being, like the Neo-Palamites seem to be, by wedging in a load of foreign, modern, and modernist influences that weren't there. But that's a really, really complex philosophical thing. I think you can see why I've sort of given people a disclaimer. In short, we need to deal with those people, and then Rome needs to be decided on. There needs to be a universal recognition by all Orthodox, and in theory they do recognise this, that Rome has primacy. There also needs to be a universal understanding that the supremacy of the Pope and the infallibility of the Pope doesn't mean what they think it means. If anything, it restricts what the Pope can do. If you actually read the documents and see the effect of it. So what does papal infallibility actually do? It makes the Pope essentially state a few words before making an infallible statement, rather than before it being a lot more, maybe a lot less clear, a lot more vague. So for example, I've read documents, I think his name was Pope Saint Fabianus I, and he wrote a document to all the bishops of the East, commanding them in very, very strong terms. There's a copy of the Latin online, actually, somewhere, where he commands them in no uncertain terms that they are to celebrate the Chrism once a year. In no uncertain terms, like it looks like an apostolic command. But this was written in the 3rd century. Likewise, there's another letter by Pope Saint Eusebius I from around 310 AD, which isn't translated but has the title, at least so far as my Latin allows, called The Direct Audiences to Alexandria and to all of Egypt. And these sorts of commands appear to exist quite a bit before the schism of 1054. And I can understand why the East would be irritated by this, because it was very... Not only was there obviously the power thing going on, but it was obviously not always as clear as it could be what was a command and what wasn't. Whereas Vatican I essentially made it clear when there was an apostolic, infallible statement made, and there's only been 2 that I'm aware of. The first one was that Mary was immaculately conceived, which I think is self-evident, and the other one was the Assumption of Mary, and I think both of our groups agree that that one is self-evident. So there just needs to be an agreement on that, and from what I've heard from the Archbishop of Dioclesia, Callistos Ware, there appears to be that sort of understanding developing in the ecumenical talks between the bishops of the Eastern Orthodox Church and with Catholic cardinals and such. This sort of understanding of the primacy of Rome as a 3rd category, because originally they just had, I think it was specifically bishoprics, and then they had another level which was like patriarchates and autonomous regions, and Rome was just one of them. Whereas there was this talk in Ravenna, according to Archbishop Callistos Ware, that the Pope got a 3rd category, which was based off of his primacy, which I pray is a way that we can reach some sort of compromise, of course acknowledging the authority of the 4 Eastern Patriarchs, because these are important things to recognise, and they've been recognised in the past. If there's one thing for any of the Orthodox who are listening that I'd like to reassure them of, it's that we don't want to stamp out your practices. The Eastern Catholic practices have sustained themselves, even though you may view them as apostates. I mean, that's another thing, like the whole saints thing. The whole saints thing is a misunderstanding as well, because we acknowledge cults of saints when we adopt the church. It's not some sort of, underhanded move that we do by acknowledging, say, Saint Seraphim of Sarov as a saint within, say, the Russian Catholic Church. It's just common practice. We have this in England. There's Saint Alfred the Great, who's recognised as a local saint. There's Saint Charlemagne, who is recognised as a local saint in Aachen, and I think in a lot of West Germany. These are things that are considered local, and likewise the Eastern Catholic Churches, the Uniates, as the question calls them, recognises these as well. It's not a matter of trying to propagandize you into being dominated by Rome, and such conspiracy theory talk is absurd. Because, I mean, we want to help souls as much as you want to help them yourselves. We don't particularly want to be deceived, but at the same time, the conspiracy theory bollocks, all that ever does is deceive us. And you can tell this from the book of Proverbs. I suggest you go and read it. The second question is the following. What is your view on the fate of unbaptized children? Asks Adrian. Again, thank you very much, Adrian. These questions all came from Adrian so far. So, there appears to be two views that are predominant, at least in the Catholic point of view. There is the view that unbaptized children go directly to heaven, which is a more modern view. And then there's the view of St. Augustine that unbaptized children go to... I can't remember if he describes it as the least possible hell, or of no purgatory, just kind of a limbo of the unborn, it's often called by the medieval theologians. And my opinion, I'm not quite sure, because on one hand they have original sin, and they obviously have had no opportunity to be baptized and cleansed from that, and therefore that could doom them to eternal fire. But at the same time, I'm aware of God's infinite mercy in that these children were never granted the opportunity to be baptized, and they didn't know any better, so they couldn't have... Well, they certainly don't have culpability for anything they do up to the age of 7, but in birth, I suppose they have a certain level just of, imperfection. They could never really choose God, in a way. They never really... I mean, you don't need to choose God in baptism either. You just have to be of a level of humility to receive the sacrament. At least that's what I got from Matthew 3, I think it was. This is me completely spitballing here. I have a feeling that it would probably be something more like the limbo of the unborn, where it's the thing is that I think Augustine describes it as least possible hell. But that's not really representative of what the theologians actually thought. There wasn't any fire, these children aren't being punished. It's, as far as I understand, the greatest possible material paradise. If you remember if you've ever read Dante Alighieri's Inferno, at the very beginning, I think it's the 3rd stanza, Dante with Virgil enters into... It might even be the 5th stanza now I think about it. Dante and Virgil enter into this material paradise with people like Saladin and Julius Caesar and, poets and philosophers, Aristotle and Plato, and it's this great material paradise, but there's this air of sorrow to it, because they now know, of course, that God is there, and that they could have pursued him, and I think he also depicts babies there explicitly. But that's what I suspect would happen to these children, right? They didn't do anything wrong aside from the original sin, which is just there by virtue of their nature. I mean, it could either be that, or they could be presented with some sort of means of discerning the state of their soul in reality. They're given a test or something, but I don't know. My instinct tells me to side with the decision of the medieval theologians and with Dante Alighieri in this respect. I would, of course, hope that I'm wrong, but that's the general gist I get out of what I've read. So take my opinion with a pinch of salt. The final question, I'm going to try and do 3 or so in each of these, is from Mactir Iarainn, which is a Gaelic name, but I can't pronounce it properly. Can you explain the Filioque from the Catholic point of view? Well, I'll just give the Christian point of view, because the Eastern Orthodox bishops also agreed to the Filioque, and as far as I understand, the Prots do too. The Eastern Orthodox agreed to the Filioque in the Second Council of Lyon, and in Ferrara, Florence. And they also implicitly accept it because they accept Athanasius of Alexandria. So, what is the Filioque and where did it come from? Well, it came from a number of sources. The two that spring to mind are the Western source, which is the Athanasian Creed, which was written at the end of the 5th century AD, if I remember correctly, by a bishop down in the south of France. This was during the iarainn schism, if you want something to Google. And it states explicitly there that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In addition, there is a letter by Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, which I don't think was translated for quite a while, but I think is implicit in a lot of Eastern writing anyway, where it says that the Holy Spirit is in the image of the Son. So, in a sense, the Holy Spirit has some form of connection to the Son, obviously through the ousia, but there's also something deeper there, because he's certainly not in the image of the Father, he proceeds from the Father. So, the distinction that is present within the Western theologians, principally Richard of St. Victor, but also Aquinas repeats this in Contra Errores Graecorum, which is free and online if you can stomach that kind of theology, is that the Spirit, in principle, proceeds from the Father. So, first of all, proceeds from the Father, because, of course, the Father begets the Son, and, the Holy Spirit can't proceed, primarily from that, which is what I think the Eastern Orthodox think we believe. That would be Sabellianism. I can understand why they accuse us of this. But, on the other hand, the Holy Spirit is spirated through the Son, which, so far as I understand, is like a secondary procession, right? So it's the Father and the Son, and it represents more this idea established by St. Athanasius of Alexandria in these letters to Serapion, in that it's the image, and it makes sense that you would also have the Filioque because, the Father and I are one. They are consubstantial. But I don't think this is really the issue. The issue appears to be that the creed was modified without the East being consulted. So far as I understand, the very first use of the Father and the Son, Filioque, was established in the 6th century at the Synod of Toledo, and that was specifically the decision of a number of bishops in that particular area to modify the creed in order to preach to Arians better. So, just to explain it better. And then it was formalised, I think, at the Council of Nice. And this doesn't violate previous convention or any of the previous ecumenical councils. I went and read through it. The bishops, it says explicitly, I think in Chalcedon, that lay people, priests and monks cannot modify the creed. But I think that bishops can, because bishops are excluded. So a synod would be able to modify the creed just fine. But this is something that I need to research into more. All I know is that it's not quite what the Eastern Orthodox think, and the fact that I think it was Pope Benedict XVI, when he met with the Ecumenical Patriarch in 2006, said, when they said the creed together, proceeds from the Father, it's not really that much of an issue. I think it's more of a semantic issue to destroy Arianism, and to convey the relationship between the Holy Spirit and the Son better, which I think the Eastern Orthodox may have interpreted in a less than charitable way. Granted, there were some other weird things going on in the West at the time, like bishops being like heads of armies, and bishops being elected via money, paying for offices and stuff like that. Although, granted, this also happened in parts of the East, as far as I'm aware as well. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all I really had to say. These are all the questions that I'll answer. Next week is going to be something a little less theological. I've already got a number of questions relating to things that are a little bit more normie. Maybe is the best way of putting it. But anyway, I hope this was useful. I hope you're treating this like a podcast, because I certainly am. Thank you very much for listening, and I will post another one of these on the next Saturday. Thanks for listening. Goodbye. I'd like to thank the people on the Renaissance Man programme who you'll see on screen. They've helped me so much over the last couple of months, and hopefully they've received good and satisfactory content from the Renaissance Man program, which you can find in the description of the video. Thank you very much for watching.